And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on Pacifica Radio Network, Progressive Radio Network, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iTunes, at opednews.com/podcasts, where you can get our complete archives going back for about 12 years, about over 450 interviews. My guest for this show is Katherine Stewart. She's the author of the new book, The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the American Prospect, the New Republic, and other publications. She's also the author of a previous book, The Good News Club, an investigation of the religious right and public education. Her website is katherinestewart.me. That's KATHERINESTEWART.me. Great to have you on the show, and congratulations, your book just came out last week, right?
Thank you so much, Rob. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So what's your goal for this book if it's successful?
Well, I'd like people to understand, first and foremost, that what we're looking at is really not a stance in the culture wars. It's a political movement, and its goal is power. So I think when we think about the religious right, we're often thinking of a movement that operates from the bottom up. It reflects a number of concerns of people who are worried about changes in society, changes in the family, and it's expressing their anxieties to rapidly social changing realities. But Christian nationalism works from the top down. It actively shapes its target population, and it often shifts its target. When we think of the religious right, we're often thinking, as I said, about a cultural movement preoccupied with symbolic issues like crosses on public lands, or preoccupied with certain issues that have acquired extraordinary importance, such as certain aspects of reproductive care or LGBT equality. But Christian nationalism is a political movement and not a position in the culture wars. And it didn't arise out of the abortion issue, for instance. It actually actively shaped certain issues like abortion in order to unite disparate strands of what it could see as a movement in its quest for political power.
So you've put 10 years into researching this and attending a whole lot of religious meetings and what have you, interviewing lots of people. It's a lot of commitment. What do you want this book to do if you're successful with it? How do you want it to change the world, to change people?
Well, I think we as a society can't hope to meet our challenges unless people understand what they are. I think for too long now, people have misunderstood and underestimated the movement and persisted in seeing it through a culture war lens. And I'd like people to understand that this is a political movement that wants power. When I think it helps in understanding the movement to distinguish between the leaders and the followers. The followers may sincerely believe they're fighting for things like an end to abortion or preservation of what they call the traditional family. But over time, leaders of the movement have actively shaped these issues in order to capture a subsection of the votes of the American public. They're incredibly organized. And, it's interesting when leaders of the movement are talking to the rank and file, or talking to pastors who are supposed to reach the rank and file in order to capture their votes or persuade them to vote for so-called biblical values. It's all abortion all the time. But when you hear leaders talk to one another, or in the forums that they share, or when they're speaking to largely sympathetic audiences, or to their political allies or their funders, they advocate an incredibly broad range of policy positions in economic policy, social policy, even foreign policy. And that drives home the fact that this is a political movement that wants power. So I think if we look at, the reasons for the dysfunction we're seeing in our national political theater today, we really can't understand how that came about without looking at the role of this movement.
Reading your book, this is a scary group. They really want to dismantle democracy. They want to take over education. They want to wipe out public education. You tell a story that is almost apocalyptic in terms of democracy and free thinking.
Well, I think it's not a surprise if you look at the dysfunction in our politics today. You know, people understand that we're dealing with a movement that doesn't really respect a modern pluralistic democracy that we have. I mean, I think that the situation seems extreme, but if you look at the, you know, people are always asking, how is it possible that the religious right could stand behind a leader like Trump, one full of so many sort of personal imperfections, to say the least, and someone who sort of gets out there and even does things like play politics with the threat of a worldwide pandemic, and behaves so irresponsibly in so many other ways. And, you know, a lot of people think it's because he will elect judges that are favorable to their interests, or elect, you know, or enact economic policies that are favorable to their pocketbooks. But it goes beyond that. I mean, this is why they compare him to biblical leaders like Cyrus or King David. There is something in his authoritarian style of rule that appeals to a movement that doesn't have much respect for the two-party system or even democracy itself. Leaders of the movement are often looking at their political opponents not as human beings with legitimate differences of opinion, or, you know, what they might see as sort of the wrong way to do things. They, you know, they often compare, they often literally demonize their political opponents, claim that secularists or humanists, or, you know, the LGBT totalitarians, as one activist put it, are out there wreaking havoc in society and trying to destroy everything that is honorable and good.
So you say that they demonize them. So
Yes.
what they do is they say that they're of the devil, right?
I've heard that at some of the strategy meetings that I've attended. In chapter 1 of my book, I describe how a gathering of pastors, there was a leader who was speaking, and he was comparing the political opponents of the partisan candidates he favors to, you know, the wiles of the devil and that type of thing. You know, it's very clear from his speech that the Democrats were on that side of the aisle. But I want to go back to what you said before about, you know, the larger movement. I mean, this is what authoritarians do. If you look at leaders around the world, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Vladimir Putin in Russia, or Erdogan in Turkey, when they ally themselves with hyper-conservative religious groups in their societies in order to consolidate an authoritarian form of power, we rightly recognize this as a form of religious nationalism, and that's what we're seeing in our politics today.
Yeah, I want to get into that. You talked about King Cyrus and King David, and I know you wrote a piece on this in the New York Times, and I know that some of the leaders of this group have referred to them as examples of why it is okay to just flaunt democracy, to just throw it out, and why people who like disobey Trump or disrespect Trump or challenge him are basically violating the precepts of the Bible.
Right. If you've persuaded yourself that society is under dire threat, not from people with differences of political opinion, but from a force that is, you know, an agent of Satan, and that is trying to destroy everything that is good in the world, you know, you can justify anything in order to defeat it. And I think that the comparison of Trump with someone like Cyrus, a leader who they see as a kind of imperfect vessel that has been chosen to do God's work, it shows the kind of longing for the hard hand of a despot.
Tell us a little bit more about this, the history of Cyrus, what its story is in the Bible.
Well, the details, it is a Persian king. The details are less important than what he actually represents to the Christian nationalists. They see him as a leader who was sort of raised up by God, as many of the leaders say of the movement, for such a time as this, to defend the tribe against its mortal enemies. And that's why they compare Trump to Cyrus. Other religious traditions and individuals view Cyrus differently, but this is what Christian nationalists mean when they refer to Trump as Cyrus. Other leaders of the movement have referred to Trump in similarly, I don't know, you could say in similar ways. Paula White said, "It is God who raises up a king." Franklin Graham, a pastor who's done an awful lot of work sort of that drives support for Republican candidates with his various tours around the country, has said, I'm paraphrasing here, I don't have the quote in front of me, he said something like, Trump is, I believe God put Trump here for this particular purpose. Other leaders of the movement have called Trump God's guy or God's candidate. Lance Wallnau, another politically connected religious leader, wrote a book in which he compared Trump to King Cyrus. And he wrote, again, I'm going to paraphrase because I don't have the book in front of me. He said that Trump was basically, standing between, was the wall that stands between that stands against cultural collapse, was saving America from cultural collapse. So they use this language that the rest of us see as really hyperbolic, but it's very effective in persuading the rank and file that they need to vote for Trump and that he's the one to put their loyalty behind.
So what we need to do is really get a clear picture of who these people are. You what's the term that you use to describe them? What is it?
Well, I use the term religious nationalists.
Religious nationalists. What are they? What is a religious?
Well, religious nationalism, as I mentioned, is not unique to America, even though Christian nationalists in America are always talking about American exceptionalism. There's nothing particularly exceptional about the form of religious nationalism we're seeing here. It does bear similarities with other forms of religious nationalism around the globe. As I mentioned before, when hard-fisted, hard-handed leaders ally themselves with religious conservatives in their countries in order to consolidate authoritarian forms of power. This is religious nationalism. It's been used over time and in many places. And I think that's what's happening with Trump's alliances with religious hyper-conservatives today. But when you ask about the people in the movement, I think, it's really important to remember that people come to the movement with a variety of concerns. We have incredibly vast growth of wealth inequality in our country. This is very well documented by economists and political scientists on all ends of the economic spectrum. And we have a rapidly changing pace of technology, for instance. I think that membership in the movement offers a lot of people a sense of security, a position that their world is safe. They respond to a desire for community or a desire for a chance to love and honor God and Scripture. There are a lot of reasons why people are sort of drawn to the movement, and in person, many of these folks can be incredibly kind and sympathetic. I think all of their good efforts, unfortunately, I think the price of belonging to the movement for many of the rank and files, for sure, is the surrendering of their political will to leaders who claim to have the answers. So I've spoken to large numbers of folks who don't particularly love Trump, but they said, I have to vote my biblical values. I want to save the babies, that kind of thing. I think many of them may not see themselves as part of a movement, but they have been drawn into the movement as political actors through their votes.
So you say that the people in this movement have turned religion into a tool for political power, and that it's not.
That's the leaders of the movement have. The leaders have, yes.
No longer a culture war, and that they've masqueraded as a social movement, preoccupied with cultural issues such as abortion and same-sex marriage. But the truth is, this is a political movement, and its ultimate goal is power, and it's a political war, a war over the future of democracy. And you give a history of how things changed. I mean, you talk about how Goldwater supported Planned Parenthood.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, conservatives, these are not conservatives.
Well, when in an earlier time, when abortion was not an issue that united the movement at all. In fact, it was largely seen, the support or antipathy for abortion was largely felt, was seen as an issue between Protestants and Catholics. Remember, when Roe v. Wade passed, the Southern Baptist Convention had a wire service, and they hailed the decision. They said it was a good intermediate position between what they called abortion on demand and a total ban, which they saw as unfair and inhumane. Betty Ford hailed the passage of Roe v. Wade as a great, great decision. Ronald Reagan in 1967 signed into law the most liberal abortion law in the country. And yes, our great conservative hero, Barry Goldwater, expressed support for legalization, at least early in his career. His wife, Peggy, was a co-founder of Planned Parenthood. Can you imagine any wife of any conservative religious leader or any female conservative religious leader political leader doing that today? That just wouldn't happen. But over time, the leaders of a political movement called the New Right, which is a movement that played an enormous role in uniting disparate strands of the movement and creating the larger movement that we have today. They were looking for an issue to settle upon that would unite conservative Catholics, conservative Protestants, and other sort of disparate strands of the movement. And over time, they settled on abortion as the issue that could serve that function.
So this is a huge change. I mean, how did it shift? This was a seismic shift for the conservatives.
It took some time. I mean, remember, even Phyllis Schlafly, early in her career, did not see her, she's known as an anti-abortion activist, but early in her career, this wasn't the issue that animated her the most. First, it was an antipathy toward communism. She warned at one point that, if America didn't change its course, it was going to become communist by 1970. And the day she said, so I have the quote in my book again, the day we started the pro-family movement was not Roe v. Wade, but it was the day it brought at least 1,000 activists to Springfield, Illinois, to march against the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. So abortion mattered.
The Nazis marched.
Well, abortion mattered to her too, but at that time as only one part of a larger attack on what she saw as women's role and women's dignity within the family. That's how she cast it. And that was sort of that was the underpinning in her mind for the attack on the ERA.
But the thing is, that's not really what these nationalist religion people are about. That's that's the bait. And we're going to take a brief break now, and then when we get back, you'll talk about the bait, okay?
Exactly.
Okay, so we need 20 seconds.
Okay, well, let me close the door. Hold on, sorry. Just enough time.
And my guest for this show is Katherine Stewart. She's the author of The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. And we've been talking about these religious nationalists and how they're really not in a culture where it's not about religion for them, it's about power, and how they're a threat to democracy, and how the issues, the dog whistle issues, the bait that they use to get tens of millions of people to back them is really not what they're about. So tell us what they're about, and tell us what the bait is that they use.
It's not entirely, it's partly, it's about the use of religion for political power, absolutely. But when you look at what they say with one another, what they say to their funders, what they say to their political allies, it's really about a wide range of policy positions, many of which, look, the movement depends critically on the support of a subsection of Americans' hyper-wealthy elite. So they advocate for minimal workers' rights. They advocate for certain kinds of tax structures. They advocate for relaxed environmental policies, minimal government regulation of businesses. And this is music to the ears, of course, of the movement's most plutocratic funders. There's an irony here that many of the rank and file are actually responding and are drawn to the movement because of their own sense that the world has entered a state of disorder. A lot of that is driven by growing wealth inequality. And yet the policy position, so when they vote on abortion, they're going to be voting for a hyper-conservative political candidate who in turn is voting for economic policies that will intensify that wealth inequality. So it's really a kind of larger dysfunction of the American political system. Leaders of the movement know that if you can get people to vote on one or two issues, you can get their vote. But many of the people who are voting on these culture war issues don't realize that they're also voting for economic policies that are going to further distort the situation and disempower workers and things like that.
And hurt themselves.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to tell you what this looked like when I went to visit a church in Chula Vista, California. It was a gathering of dozens of conservative-leaning Latino pastors, most of whom work with, I would say, working class to middle class congregations. So not wealthy demographics. And the leader, one of the leaders of the event, who sort of stood up and telling all of the pastors how they should get their congregations to vote for conservative candidates, he said, when you're talking to your congregations about these issues, what's more important, talking about the minimum wage or about life? So when you put it that way, what's more important, a few extra dollars or life? So they're really kind of, or life itself. They're trying to give a message to these conservative-leaning Latino pastors who are going to be favorable to a culturally conservative message that you need to turn your congregations out to vote their so-called biblical values, which reduce to those issues. But in doing so, those folks are going to be voting also for economic policy, for a political party that has implemented the separation of families, for instance, at the border as a strategy that is voting to strip workers of their rights, doesn't believe in the minimum wage and things like that.
So the issues that they sell are kind of like a Trojan horse.
They're Trojan horses, and they're so important that the messaging on those issues is relentless. I mean, one of the things the right is really good at, they're underestimated in so many ways, I think, by many progressives. And one of the things they're really good at is messaging. They produce messaging that's very responsive over time to different demographics and different changes in the zeitgeist. So for instance, I attended an Evangelical for Life conference, and they had seminars there for college students, and they are offering specific messaging for other college students that trade on this, they sort of exploit this, the idea of equality. And they're like, well, the idea of equality is really important for our generation. So you can talk about abortion, say it's discrimination based on their age, which they said really works with younger people because they're really against discrimination. So they're adjusting their messaging all the time, directing it to different specific populations.
That's framing, yeah. So your first book was The Good News Club, an investigation of the religious right and public education. Can you tell us a story that would tie this all together?
Well, I can tell you a story of how I got interested in the topic.
Yeah.
I was living in Santa Barbara with my family. A Good News Club came to my daughter's public elementary school. The group promised to teach Bible study to children who are too young to read. They target elementary age kids. Children attending the club, I discovered, were targeting their peers for faith-based bullying and bigotry, and trying to recruit, often offered candy to recruit their peers to the club. And the kids attending the club would say, I know it's true, this religion, because they taught it to me in school. And they don't teach religion. We don't teach things in school that aren't true. So public schools have a kind of cloak of authority in the minds of young children especially. And they think they can't distinguish between an activity taking place in school and one sponsored by their school. They think if it's in their school, it must be what their school wants them to believe.
Of course.
So this kind of initiative just astonished me. I just thought, how is it possible that these groups are operating in thousands of public elementary schools across the country, given the separation of church and state? So I started to dig deeper. And the more I learned about Good News Clubs, the more I realized they were just part of a larger attack on public education as a whole. And the more I learned about the attack on public ed, the more I realized it was just one small part of a larger attack on America as a constitutional republic.
Yeah, but I mean, we've got the Department of Education, and they would never allow anything like that to happen, would they?
Betsy DeVos, her family, as you well know, her family and her husband's played an outsized role in the early funding of some of the leading policy groups of the religious right. Interestingly, they also donated at least $5 million to the ministry of a fellow named D. James Kennedy. Oh gosh, I wish I had it in front of me. I have his pamphlet. He's got this amazing pamphlet that's like this screed against public education. He calls it, atheistic and promoting atheistic unbelief. And he has some quote in there, some line where he says, if this had been an act perpetrated by a foreign government upon our children, it would have been considered an act of war. And, so the hostility to public education in this cohort has some really deep roots. It runs a lot further back than D. James Kennedy. We can see a lot of that hostility coming through a mid-century theologian named John Rushdoony. And before that, he drew explicitly from some of the pro-slavery theologians, people like Robert Louis Dabney and his admirer, a fellow named Hodge, who criticized what he called government schools. I believe it was like 1889 or something like that. I don't have the date in front of me, but these folks expressed hostility to government schools, or what they call government schools or public schools, because number one, public schools have to serve a diverse population. So they neither are supposed to neither affirm nor deny anybody's belief. They're just a place for all kids. But, you know, they promote, because of the fact that they're pluralistic, there is a kind of tacit acceptance of pluralism within the public school environment. You know, doesn't matter if you're Catholic or Jewish or Muslim or Protestant or whatever you are, you're allowed to send your kids to public schools. They came into being to serve a diverse public, but the sort of religious hyper-conservatives were afraid that if their children were attending these public schools, they would somehow lose their religion. So that's one source. But another source actually arose, if you look back to the pro-slavery theologians like Robert Louis Dabney. He objected to public schools not just because they were what he called atheistic, but also because he didn't think white people should be taxed to provide education to Black children. And therefore, he was really scathing when it came to public schools for this very reason.
That's particularly despicable. Now, I just want to make really clear, you know, I made a joke about the Department of Public Education because one of the members of this religious nationalist group, one of the most powerful funders of it, is Betsy DeVos, and she's running the Department of Education for the United States now. This is not some under the radar movement. This is huge, and they grabbed huge chunks of power.
Yes, I mean, let's consider this. So there's this fellow named Ralph Drollinger. He has a ministry called Capital Ministries. You can look at his sermons online, and none of this is hidden. He targets political leaders at the highest levels of power. At least 10 out of Trump's former and current cabinet members have attended his ministry, according to an article in the New York Times Magazine. He's conducting shadow diplomacy on behalf of the administration. And if you look at the policy positions he advocates in his multiple sermons and writings, you can see how radical this movement is. He calls, at one point he published a sermon in which he talks about a Bible study in which he talks about the need for a flat tax immediately. He's against progressive income taxes. He is against public funding of the social safety net. He's against women in leadership. He's sort of, in one interview, he kind of threw up his hand and says, oh, it might not be what I want, but it's what God wants. And interestingly, he didn't come up with these ideas. I mean, he did a lot of his training as a pastor at an institution called the Master's Seminary, which is in Southern California. The leader of that seminary was an ardent advocate of what they call male headship and female submission, not only at work, but also at home. Someone who had worked with him at that seminary, the Master's Seminary, for a quarter decade, told me that, you know, if you found out your wife worked, he'd fire you or he'd give you a raise, and so you could sort of tell her she had to stay at home. It's pretty interesting.
Wow. Yeah, and I did a whole interview with Catherine Joyce, who wrote Quiverful about.
What a wonderful writer she is,
yeah.
And what a masterful book that is.
Yes. So, but is this 100% Republican, conservative? What about Democrats? Are there people on the Democratic side? I mean, look, you've got the Deep South, you've got the Southern Baptist Convention. Are any of them in any way connected to this?
You know, it's interesting. At the Marches for Life, I will always see, like, they'll try and find the one pro-life Democrat that they can find. There's one woman whose name escapes me right now, but she has appeared at the last couple of Marches for Life to speak. And it kind of gives I think they really brought out to give the appearance of diversity to a movement that really is driving support for one political party alone. There are very few Democrats that could cede enough ground to actually receive the support of this movement.
Well, maybe Henry Cuellar and Dan Lipinski, they're both anti-abortion.
I believe I'm not sure if he's appeared at Marches for Life, but a couple of, one or two others have.
Yeah. So you talk about fictionalized history and the creation of religions. What's that about?
Well, when we talk about fictionalized history, sometimes we're talking about David Barton, who is the movement's favored sort of fringe historian. He takes religious leaders and political leaders on tours of the nation's capital to indoctrinate them with the right talking points about how America was allegedly found as a so-called Christian nation. And founders were all supposedly Bible thumpers, which is not true. America's founded as in a secular republic, and the founders had a diversity of religious beliefs. Some were more religiously conservative, others were deists. But
like Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Jefferson Bible, which took out all reference to Jesus, I believe.
Indeed. That's absolutely true. But the reality is does not seem to get in the way of folks like David Barton, who has also produced a number of books. And he's actually sits on the boards of so many religious nationalist initiatives, data initiatives, legislative initiatives targeting state legislatures. I call him the Where's Waldo of the Christian nationalist movement, because he just seems to be everywhere.
Okay. So,
and by the way, one of his books was actually redacted and withdrawn by its publisher, Thomas Nelson Publishing, which is a religious publishing house. It came out, it was called something like The Jefferson Lies, which it actually was. It was full of lies about Jefferson, apparently, or so many historians have alleged. And they withdrew it because they were concerned that there were points of fact that were just wrong. And that was kind of unprecedented for them to withdraw a book from publication. But it doesn't seem to have appeared to get in Barton's way.
Yeah. How are they changing churches?
What do you mean by that? I mean, there are so many directions to go with this question.
You're talking about historians, you're talking about trainers, you're talking about people who are teaching them how to frame their messaging. Are churches being are they transitioning? Are they being transformed in some uniform ways?
Yes, absolutely. There's several parts to this question. And the first is that the movement understand that pastors drive votes, and therefore they've made enormous efforts to get pastors involved in networks like Watchmen on the Wall, which is the Family Research Council's network of over 25,000 pastors. And they give them messaging tools, they give them tools that try and help them turn out their congregations to vote their so-called biblical values. Everything from voter guides to detailed instructions on how to form culture impact teams within their churches, which appear to be intended to get around IRS guidelines prohibiting pastors from politicking from the pulpit. So a pastor is not allowed to say, I think you should vote for this candidate, from the pulpit. They can say it as private citizens, but not from the pulpit. But if you can get congregants to do it within churches, and therefore it's not you, it's a different story. So there's this toolkit. It's called a Culture Impact Team Manual, and it offers very detailed instructions on how to, for the pastors, figure out who at your church is politically engaged and motivated to turn out other congregants to vote. And then you sort of put together a team of folks who can be on what they call this culture impact team that is then tasked with communicating so-called biblical values to other congregants. So a few years ago, I interviewed a pastor who was involved in this type of initiative, and he said to me, he called it it threads a separation of church and state loophole. That's what he said.
This is a very bottom-up strategy, though, actually.
Yeah, it's a very bottom-up strategy in that way, but it's the pastors who are sort of giving them these tools, and it's the movement leaders at the very top, the heads of the policy organizations and the like, who are giving those instructions to the pastors. So that's one way that churches are getting transformed.
We need to take a break now for 20 seconds. And my guest for this show is Katherine Stewart. Let me do that again. My guest for this show is Katherine Stewart. She's the author of The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. And you're going to tell us more about how they're affecting the churches.
Yeah. So many of America's conservative churches have been turned essentially into cells of a shadow political party. If you can get congregants to vote according to those cultural issues, you can get them to throw their support behind the political candidates that the movement favors. I remember a few years ago, I was at a Road to Majority conference, headed up by Ralph Reed. He's one of the leaders of the most powerful policy groups. And he said, don't pay attention to the polls. It doesn't matter what percentage of the electorate, of the population we are, that is declining. All that matters is who turns out on election day. I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but he said that, the important thing is to turn out the vote in disproportionate numbers. And if you do that, you can turn an election.
Yep. Yeah, and that's what they've been doing.
Here's another way that they're transforming churches. When I was writing my book, I thought about writing a chapter about efforts to infiltrate mainline denominations and replace leadership perceived as liberal with more those who adhere to more conservative values.
Sounds like the kind of thing that Eric Prince would do.
Well, it's interesting. There are right-wing, what they call renewal groups that have made efforts to do that. One of the groups that's been written about by John Dorhauer and Sheldon Culver is called the Institute for Religion and Democracy. They call it steeplejacking. The idea is that church is sort of taken over by more conservative governance and then taken out of the denomination. And in some instances, when they take the congregation out of the denomination, they take the real estate asset with them. And I actually, when I was researching this section, I spoke to maybe a half dozen pastors around the country who head up or used to head up United Methodist churches, United Church of Christ churches. I also spoke to a number of sources within the Episcopalian Church about conflicts within that denomination as well. And I didn't end up writing that up as a chapter, but I will at some point. So you'll just have to wait to read about it when I do.
Okay. The people and the organizations, you talk about some billionaires involved, and you talk about think tanks and advocacy groups, and who are some of the ones that should be on our radar? Right.
I mean, your point is absolutely correct. It's a decentralized movement. It relies on think tanks, policy groups, legal advocacy organizations, and other types of networking organizations and initiatives. So some of the groups I focused on in my book are, of course, well, on the legal side, I focused on the Alliance Defending Freedom, which has been called the sort of legal juggernaut of the Christian right. then other organizations like the Federalist Society and Judicial Crisis Network have placed an outsized role in selecting candidates for different courts. The consequences of all of that effort, of course, we're seeing in our courts today. I think it's 192 federal judges that we're up to, just over 22% of the judiciary. So that's on the legal side. And there are other right-wing legal advocacy groups as well. The American Center for Law and Justice, which was founded by Jay Sekulow, Trump's lawyer. They also have an overseas division, which is a whole other story, as does the ADF. On the policy side, you have groups like the Family Research Council, Focus on the Family, Faith and Freedom Coalition, and many other groups. I mean, there's just a vast network of these organizations and initiatives. Some of the policy initiatives that are really interesting to me that I focused on in my book are Project Blitz, which is a legislative initiative that seeks to flood state legislatures with like hundreds of bills that are all of them intended to chip away at the separation of church and state in all of these small ways. And the authors of Project Blitz have kind of organized their legislative initiatives into 3 different categories according to level of difficulty of passage. So the first level is going to be stuff that seems really symbolic, like putting "In God We Trust" signs in public schools, and as a consequence, or even on police cars, putting "In God We Trust" signs on police cars and in public buildings, that kind of thing. And these are things that could be perceived as symbolic. And as David Barton, who's one of the sort of leaders of this initiative, said, there are things that liberals are going to yell at, but they'll push the ball down the court. And then the next layers of legislative initiatives are just much more consequential as far as church-state separation is concerned. And all of them are designed ultimately to entrench their version of the Christian religion as a basis for law and policy. So then degrade the separation of church and state.
And so, you know, these people are the ones who complain about the Taliban, about Muslims and trying to bring Sharia law to America. They're really the Christian Taliban. They're really trying to do to us exactly what they criticize, this fantasy of Muslim threat to America.
The movement will, leaders would object to that. They would say, of course, we're not trying to do that. But if you look at their legislative initiatives and what they're really trying to do with this sort of what they call the religious liberty agenda or the religious liberty movement, it's really not about, it's actually going to reduce religious liberty, which is the freedom of worship that we all enjoy if we have a religion and freedom of belief and right to gather and worship. But what they're really trying to do is enshrine into law a license to discriminate, a power to discriminate, the power only of people who believe correctly, or supposedly correctly, people who hold the supposedly correct beliefs, to discriminate against others whose lifestyles or very being they disapprove of. And the irony here is that if your religious beliefs reduce to the idea that, let's say, you are entitled to equal protection under the law, and yet you come into, or you're entitled to, you know, evidence-based medicine in a Catholic healthcare setting, no matter what your problems, what your medical problems or crises may be, your religious liberty will be overruled under the way that they're thinking, and certainly under the Catholic healthcare system as it exists today. Your religious liberty will be overruled by the religious liberty of those who are deemed to have their beliefs enshrined as a position of privilege.
It makes me think of the rapture movement, where they want to be, they believe that those who believe and have faith will be raptured off to heaven and all the unbelievers will be left behind. And it's almost like they want to make it happen here. They want the believers to be in heaven and everybody else to have no rights and no freedoms and to be subjected to the domination of these people.
You know, it's interesting that the movement is not united by theology. There are many, the movement includes representatives of both Protestant and non-Protestant religion. It includes members of the New Apostolic Reformation, for instance, some of whose beliefs would be considered heretical to hardline thinkers like, you know, Ralph Drollinger. But they're really united by a political vision rather than a religious vision. And I think that that's the thing to remember. If you look at some of the really important watershed movements of unity that sort of helped this movement come together, I'm thinking specifically about the Manhattan Declaration. It was a kind of culmination of a decades-long or maybe 15-year effort to obtain some cooperation between conservative Catholics and conservative Protestants to sort of set aside their denominational differences, their theological differences, and come together in unity in opposition to you know, what they saw as the larger threat of secularism, and in pursuit of their common, certainly in pursuit of their common cultural goals. You're looking at a movement that is united more by political vision than religious vision.
What about Israel? I mean, you've got James Hagee, who's got 70 million Christian Zionists. So where does Christian Zionism and Israel fit into this, if at all?
It's interesting. The movement in recent years has started using the term Judeo-Christian an awful lot. That's interesting to note. You know, Israel, of course, for many Protestants and evangelicals, plays a key role in their theology. So that's a big part of it.
Okay. And you talk about the 7 mountains.
Yes.
Tell us about them. What's that about?
7 mountains are 7 mountains of culture, politics, religion, finance, law, arts and entertainment, family. These are what some adherents of a movement, sort of in the charismatic vein, call the 7 mountains or molders of culture. And the idea is that people who believe rightly, the right kinds of Christians, are supposed to reach and dominate those 7 mountains of culture in order to take back society and bring it back to the state where it's supposed to be. So you even see some of the, you know, it sounds fringe, but many of the leaders of the movement who are sort of behind these large-scale initiatives collaborate with people who are openly 7 mountains dominionist. And you hear references to the 7 mountains today in some of the most astonishing places. If you've paid attention, of course, to Trump rallies or some of the pastors that he's been speaking with or is allied with, if you look at someone like David Barton, who has collaborated on initiatives with Lance Wallnau, who's one of the, you know, best known and most openly, you know, forthright 7 mountains dominionist out there, you can see that this idea has really penetrated into circles that are, you know, very, very close to genuine political power.
You mentioned dominionists. Now, that's a whole nother world, or is it overlapping? What's the connection between dominionism?
I think dominionism, look, there are a lot of different words we can use for this movement. I use many of them at different times as I write. Where appropriate, I use terms like Christian right, religious right, dominionists. Theocracy is another word that a lot of people like. I prefer to, you know, I often prefer the term religious nationalism when referring to the whole, because it makes clear that it is a form of nationalism. It makes clear the sort of political aspects of the movement and also the similarities it bears with other forms of religious nationalism around the world. Dominionism is really the more openly theocratic side of the movement. And I think 20 years ago, um, you know, people who wrote about dominionism were folks made fun of them and said they were being alarmist. I remember, I think it was 2011, Michael Gerson, George W. Bush's speechwriter, said this is a movement that could fit into a phone booth. You know, today the phone booth has been installed in the White House. So I think we can set aside our premature dismissals.
Yeah, dominionists are very powerful. There's I forget his name. I had him on my show. He wrote a book about dominionists. You know who I'm talking about?
There are so many amazing writers whose work I draw on. I couldn't do the work I do without the work of so many others.
I know that I think Netflix recently did a documentary about.
Oh, Jeff Charlotte's wonderful.
Jeff Charlotte, yeah,
book. He had this fantastic book about an organization called The Family. Yes,
The Family, and they're dominionists, right?
I don't think every single member of the family would consider themselves to be a dominionist by any means. The Family is an organization that has drawn in many members over the years, but I think Charlotte has shown that it's the leaders of the family that have a particular agenda. But again, it's a leader-driven movement.
Yeah.
So,
all right, so we've got a minute left. Anything you want to wrap up with?
Well, I'm just grateful for the chance to come here and talk about this scary stuff. Look, I think, you know, the movement should be cause for alarm, but not cause for despair. I'm seeing a lot more political activism from those who support separation of church and state today than I was 4 or 5 years ago. For those who seek to defend our democratic principles and our constitutional principles, I think people are finally are really aware that there's a movement out there that really seeks to change democracy as we know it, and seeks to restore some of these principles that have, like separation of church and state, that have served our country very well since our nation's founding and have saved us from being divided and in a way that so many others have, other societies have.
It makes me think of how in more superstitious times, the idea was you had to know the name of the beast in order to fight it. And I think that that's what your book, The Power Worshippers, does.
Thank you so much.
My guest for this show has been Katherine Stewart. She's the author of The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Her website is katherinestewart.me. That's KatherineStewart.me. And thank you for being here. It's been a great interview.
Thanks so much for having me.